We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. 26 words that changed the world, words that inspired revolutions, liberation movements, and centuries of struggle for human dignity. The man who wrote them is carved into Mount Rushmore, printed on our currency, immortalized in a marble temple that draws millions of visitors seeking to touch the legacy of American freedom. Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher of liberty, the architect of American ideals, the voice of a new nation built on the radical notion that all human beings deserve equality and justice. But there's a number most Americans never learned in school: 609. That's how many human beings Thomas Jefferson owned during his lifetime. 609 people whose labor he stole, whose children he claimed as property, whose families he split apart when it suited his financial needs. The hands that penned the Declaration of Independence also signed bills of sale for 10-year-old children. The mind that conceived of a government by consent of the governed calculated the precise monetary return on forced human reproduction. Thomas Jefferson didn't just participate in slavery, he perfected it as a wealth generation system, turned it into a science, and built a fortune worth over $200 million in today's money on the backs of people he knew deserved the very freedom he proclaimed universal. This isn't a story about a complicated man living in complicated times. This is about how the philosopher who gave America its soul sold that soul for profit, year after year, decade after decade, until the day he died owing so much money that 130 human beings had to be sold at auction to pay his debts. While his white heirs inherited his name, his reputation, and his place in history, the people who actually built his wealth were scattered to the winds, sold to the highest bidder, their families destroyed to settle the accounts of a man who spent his entire life writing about liberty while denying it to everyone who made his life possible. The contradiction isn't a footnote, it's the foundation. And what you're about to discover will make you see that nickel in your pocket very differently. Because Thomas Jefferson's path to riches reveals the darkest truth about how American prosperity was actually built. Thomas Jefferson was born rich on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell Plantation in Virginia. His father, Peter, owned thousands of acres and dozens of enslaved people. His mother, Jane Randolph, came from Virginia aristocracy, the kind of family that had shaped the colony since its founding. From his first breath, Jefferson lived in a world where owning land and owning people was simply how wealth worked, as natural as the sunrise, as unquestioned as gravity. When Peter Jefferson died in 1757, 14-year-old Thomas inherited 5,000 acres and at least 20 enslaved people. 20 human beings, 20 lives that now belong to a teenager, enough to ensure Jefferson would never work for wages, never struggle for survival, never question where his next meal came from. The land made him wealthy, but it was those 20 people, those stolen lives, that made the wealth productive. Without their forced labor, the acres were just dirt. With it, the land became a machine printing money. Jefferson spent his youth absorbing Enlightenment philosophy. He read John Locke on natural rights. He studied Montesquieu on government structure. He filled his mind with radical ideas about human equality and the consent of the governed. And every single moment he spent reading those books, someone else was working his fields without pay. Every meal he ate while contemplating liberty was prepared by enslaved cooks. Every hour of leisure that let him think and write and philosophize was stolen from people who had no leisure, no freedom, no ability to contemplate anything beyond survival. The contradiction never troubled him. Or more accurately, he noticed it, wrote about it, admitted it made him uncomfortable, and then did absolutely nothing to change it. That pattern would define his entire life. Acknowledge the evil, express discomfort, keep profiting, repeat for 50 years. By age 26, Jefferson had graduated from William and Mary, studied law, and begun building the project that would consume him for decades. Monticello, the architectural masterpiece that tourists visit today, marveling at its innovation and beauty. Every brick was laid by enslaved hands. Every nail was forged by enslaved artisans. Every board was cut and shaped by enslaved carpenters. Jefferson designed it. Enslaved people built it. The tourist brochures mention the second part only in recent years, and even then carefully, gently, as if the truth might shatter the beauty. Then came 1772, and the marriage that would transform Jefferson's wealth. Martha Wales Skelton was a 23-year-old widow, educated, cultured, and by all accounts genuinely beloved by Jefferson. She was also the daughter of one of Virginia's richest men. When John Wales died in 1773, Martha inherited a massive portion of his estate, and under Virginia law, everything Martha owned became Thomas Jefferson's property the moment they married. The Wales inheritance changed everything. Jefferson gained 11,000 additional acres, but more importantly, he gained 135 enslaved people. In a single inheritance, he more than quadrupled the number of human beings he owned. At typical valuations, those 135 people represented capital worth tens of millions in today's dollars. Not because of anything they did, simply because they existed as property that could be bought, sold, worked, and bred like livestock. Among those 135 enslaved people was a girl named Sally Hemings. She was 14 years old, and according to extensive historical evidence and family oral history, she was also Martha Jefferson's half-sister, the daughter of John Wales, and an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Hemings. Sally came to Monticello as property. She would remain property for the next 53 years, until 9 months after Jefferson's death, when his daughter finally allowed her to live as a free woman. But we're getting ahead of the story, because what happened in the years after the Wales inheritance reveals how Jefferson really thought about the people he enslaved. And the document that exposes his thinking isn't some private diary historians discovered centuries later. It's a letter he sent to George Washington in 1792, written in his own hand, laying out calculations so cold they still shock people today. Jefferson was serving as Secretary of State. He was managing Monticello from Philadelphia, and he was thinking about the economics of slavery with the precision of a Wall Street analyst. In a note meant for President Washington's eyes, Jefferson calculated that he was making a 4% annual profit on the birth of enslaved children at Monticello. 4%, compounding interest on human reproduction. He wrote that he would take credit for their increase over and above keeping up their own numbers. He had discovered that his plantation wasn't just producing tobacco and wheat. It was producing people, and those people were yielding him what he called a perpetual dividend. Let that sink in for a moment. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote about inalienable rights, sat down and calculated the investment return on enslaved women giving birth. He viewed human fertility as a profit center. He treated the wombs of enslaved women as capital assets generating compound interest, and he wasn't ashamed of this calculation. He sent it to the President of the United States as if it were normal business accounting. This wasn't some aberration. This was how Jefferson thought about slavery, not as a moral evil he was trapped in, as a financial system to be optimized. Between 1774 and 1826, Jefferson enslaved over 600 people total. At any given moment, between 165 and 225 people lived and worked on his various properties, about 3/5 at Monticello, the rest at Poplar Forest, his retreat estate in Bedford County. Most he acquired through inheritance and natural increase, that clinical term for enslaved people, having children who automatically became Jefferson's property. He purchased fewer than 20 enslaved people during his entire life. Why buy when you could breed? Jefferson organized his enslaved workforce with the efficiency of a corporate manager. Field laborers at the bottom doing back-breaking agricultural work. Artisans above them trained in valuable trades like carpentry and blacksmithing. Domestic servants higher still, working in the main house. And at the top, a few trusted individuals who managed other enslaved workers. This hierarchy served multiple purposes. It divided the enslaved community, making collective resistance harder. It created incentives for some to cooperate with the system, and it let Jefferson extract maximum value from skilled workers whose services could be rented to neighbors for cash that went straight into Jefferson's pocket. The conditions were brutal by any humane standard, though Jefferson convinced himself they were enlightened compared to other plantations. Enslaved people received minimal clothing, inadequate housing, barely enough food to maintain their ability to work. Children as young as 10 worked in Jefferson's nail factory, producing thousands of nails that he sold for profit. Families could be separated at any moment based on Jefferson's financial calculations. And physical punishment, while not extensively documented in Jefferson's careful records, was an accepted tool that his overseers employed when enslaved people didn't meet productivity targets. All of this operated in parallel to Jefferson's political career, which was making him one of the most famous men in America. In 1776, at age 33, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. The document included a lengthy passage blaming King George III for forcing the slave trade on the colonies. The Continental Congress deleted it, recognizing it as absurd coming from enslavers themselves. But Jefferson tried. He wanted credit for opposing slavery without actually opposing it. He wanted to be seen as enlightened while maintaining his wealth. The pattern was set. Acknowledge the evil, shift the blame, keep profiting. The revolution enhanced Jefferson's finances rather than complicating them. When British forces raided his properties, they took about 30 enslaved people from his Elk Hill plantation. Jefferson later claimed 27 of them died in the British camp, and he sought compensation for this loss of property, calculating their monetary value the same way he'd calculate stolen horses. The people whose deaths he claimed to mourn were line items in a financial claim against Britain. Property lost. Compensation demanded. His political positions kept rising. Governor of Virginia, Minister to France, Secretary of State, Vice President, President. Each role brought new opportunities, new connections, new ways to leverage public position for private gain. During his years in France, from 1784 to 1789, Jefferson developed expensive tastes in wine and began importing bottles for resale to wealthy Americans. His political connections guaranteed customers. Enslaved workers maintained his wine cellar and handled the complex logistics. He made thousands selling French wine to American aristocrats, all facilitated by his diplomatic position and his access to free labor. France also brought Jefferson into contact with revolutionary ideas about liberty sweeping Europe. Philosophers were questioning monarchy, aristocracy, inherited privilege. The French Revolution was brewing, and Jefferson, surrounded by this intellectual ferment, brought enslaved people with him to Paris to serve his household. Among them was 14-year-old Sally Hemings, brought to attend Jefferson's youngest daughter. Sally was in Paris when she was about 16 years old, and it was there, according to her son, Madison Hemings' later testimony, that she became pregnant with Jefferson's child. The relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings lasted nearly 4 decades, from sometime in Paris until Jefferson's death. Sally bore 6 children. 4 survived to adulthood. DNA testing in 1998 confirmed what Sally Hemings's descendants had maintained for generations through oral history. Thomas Jefferson fathered her children. The historical consensus now accepts this as fact, but understanding what this means requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's property. She could not legally consent to a sexual relationship with the man who owned her. She could not refuse. She could not leave. She was 16 when this began. He was 44. Whatever emotional dynamic existed between them, the fundamental reality was coercion. Jefferson held absolute power over her life. She had none. Some historians argue there may have been genuine affection. Others call it sustained sexual abuse. Both perspectives grapple with the same undeniable fact. A middle-aged man had a decades-long sexual relationship with a teenage girl he owned, who had no legal right to say no, who bore his children into slavery, who remained his property until his death. Sally Hemings was also his late wife's half-sister through John Wales, making this relationship additionally tangled by family connections that would have been scandalous if Sally had been white. But she wasn't white, she was property. And that made all the difference in how Jefferson and his society viewed the relationship. Not as sexual abuse of a powerless teenager, just as one of those things that happened on plantations. Regrettable, perhaps, but certainly not criminal, barely even noteworthy. The children Sally Hemings bore occupied a strange liminal space at Monticello. They were enslaved like other children born to enslaved mothers, but they received special treatment. They were trained in valuable trades. They lived in better quarters. And when they reached adulthood, Jefferson freed them or allowed them to leave without pursuing them as runaways. His will freed Madison and Eston Hemings explicitly. Beverly and Harriet Hemings were allowed to leave in 1822, officially listed as runaways, though evidence suggests Jefferson permitted their departure. This selective freedom highlights Jefferson's moral calculations. He freed 10 people total out of over 600 he enslaved during his lifetime. 7 of those 10 were members of the Hemings family, all connected through Sally or her mother Elizabeth. For Jefferson, freedom wasn't a right to be recognized in all people. It was a personal favor granted to specific individuals based on private relationships. The children he fathered with Sally deserved freedom. The hundreds of other children born at Monticello deserved continued bondage. The philosophy of universal human rights somehow never applied to the actual humans whose labor built his fortune. While Jefferson's personal life grew more complicated, his financial situation was spiraling toward disaster. Despite owning over 10,000 acres and 200 enslaved people at his peak, Jefferson was always short on cash. He spent lavishly on Monticello, pouring money into renovations that never quite finished. He bought books obsessively, accumulating one of America's finest private libraries. He served expensive French wines to guests. He hosted elaborate dinners for politicians, friends, and the tourists who considered visiting Monticello a patriotic duty. He helped relatives with their debts, taking on their obligations, worsening his own finances. All this spending was enabled by enslaved labor that cost him only subsistence. The crops generating cash were planted and harvested by people who saw none of the profit. The dinners impressing guests were cooked by enslaved people who ate simpler fare. The buildings housing visitors were constructed and maintained by enslaved artisans, compensated with nothing beyond basic survival. Jefferson lived like European nobility, and like European nobility, his lifestyle depended on people who had no choice but to serve. As debts mounted, Jefferson turned to increasingly desperate measures. He mortgaged enslaved people to borrow money, using human beings as collateral. He leased out workers to neighboring plantations, pocketing rental fees, while the laborers earned nothing. And when cash shortages became acute, he sold people, splitting families, sending individuals to other plantations based purely on financial need. One transaction reveals the callousness of Jefferson's financial calculations. In 1820, he sent an enslaved man named Gil Gillette to Richmond carrying a check for $3,500 sewn into his waistcoat for safekeeping. The check was payment for enslaved people Jefferson had sold from Poplar Forest to his son-in-law. Gillette didn't know he was carrying payment for the sale of people he lived and worked alongside. 9 years later, Gillette himself was sold at auction in Charlottesville for $590. Before that final sale, Jefferson had mortgaged him and leased him to a tenant farmer, one man subjected to every feature of the American slave market because he was born as Jefferson's property. Jefferson's will, signed March 16, 1826, revealed the limits of his professed opposition to slavery. Out of more than 130 people he still owned, he freed exactly 5, Madison Hemings and Eston Hemings, his own sons, Burwell Culber, who had served him personally for decades, John Hemings and Joe Fawcett, both skilled artisans, all members of the Hemings family, all connected to Jefferson through blood or long personal service. That was it. 5 people. The other 125 remained enslaved, to be dealt with by his white heirs. Jefferson attempted to provide minimal support for those 5. They could remain in Virginia, despite laws requiring freed people to leave the state. Elderly and infirm freed people would be supported by the estate. Younger ones would be trained and freed at 21. But Jefferson provided no land, no real financial support, nothing that would give freed people a genuine chance at independence. After lifetimes building his wealth, they received only their freedom and whatever skills they'd learned while enslaved. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. The poetic timing enhanced his legend. He and John Adams died the same day, both on Independence Day, both in their 90s, as if God himself was underlining the significance of their lives. The nation mourned. Tributes poured in. Jefferson's reputation as a founding father was secure, but the reality of his death was squalid with financial desperation. He owed $107,000, equivalent to several million today. His estate was hopelessly insolvent. Monticello would have to be sold. And worst of all, 130 human beings would be sold to satisfy creditors. In January 1827, Jefferson's heirs held the auction. 130 people were put on the block and sold to the highest bidders. Families that had lived together for generations were separated. Children were sold away from parents. Elderly people went to buyers who had no interest in their welfare beyond extracting whatever labor remained. The enslaved community of Monticello was destroyed, scattered across Virginia and further south, consumed by the machinery of slavery that Jefferson had helped maintain for 50 years. Some of those sold were people Jefferson knew personally. Priscilla Hemings, who had cooked his meals, Burwell Culber's relatives, people whose names appear in his farm book, alongside careful notations of their skills and monetary value. They had made possible every comfort of his life. And in death, Jefferson consigned them to the auction block because paying his debts to white creditors mattered more than the freedom of black people whose labor had created those debts in the first place. The sale generated about $11,000, nowhere near enough to cover what Jefferson owed. The estate remained insolvent. Monticello eventually sold for a fraction of its value. Jefferson's library had already been sold to Congress years earlier. His furniture was dispersed. His agricultural equipment auctioned. Within a generation, the material wealth had vanished, dissolved under the weight of debt accumulated through a lifetime of spending beyond his means, while enslaved people generated just enough to keep the illusion alive. Sally Hemings was not among those sold. She was not freed in Jefferson's will. Technically, she remained enslaved. But Martha Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's white daughter, informally freed her, allowing her to live with her freed sons, Madison and Eston, in Charlottesville. This informal freedom was illegal under Virginia law, which required freed people to leave the state within a year. But local authorities looked the other way, perhaps out of respect for Jefferson's memory, perhaps because an elderly black woman posed no threat, perhaps because everyone knew who she was and what her relationship to Jefferson had been, and nobody wanted to confront that truth directly. Sally Hemings lived 9 years after Jefferson died. 9 years of freedom, if you can call it that. Freedom to live in poverty with her sons. Freedom to watch her descendants struggle in a state that offered them no real opportunities. Freedom to know that the man who had owned her for 40 years had died, celebrated as a hero, while she would die in obscurity, her story deliberately erased by people protecting Jefferson's reputation. Her descendants preserved the truth through oral history passed down through generations. Madison Hemings gave an interview to an Ohio newspaper in 1873, stating plainly that Thomas Jefferson was his father, that the relationship began in Paris, that Jefferson had promised Sally her children would be freed. For over a century, white historians dismissed this testimony as impossible. Thomas Jefferson would never do such a thing. The story couldn't be true. It was unthinkable. The DNA evidence in 1998 forced the reckoning that white historians had avoided for generations. The descendants of Sally Hemings had been telling the truth all along. Jefferson had fathered her children. The relationship had lasted decades. The oral history was accurate, and the historical consensus finally, grudgingly, shifted to accept what black families had never doubted. Jefferson's wealth at its peak reached extraordinary levels. Modern historians estimate his total holdings, if liquidated at fair market value, would have been worth at least $200 million in today's dollars, possibly much more depending on land valuations. That placed him among the richest Americans of his era, and every dollar of it was built on stolen land and stolen labor. The land itself had been taken from indigenous peoples. The Monacan nation had lived in the Virginia Piedmont for thousands of years before European colonization. Jefferson's Monticello sat on land that had been Monacan territory until colonial violence and disease destroyed their communities. Jefferson's father participated in that dispossession through surveying work. Jefferson benefited from genocide that cleared Virginia for plantation agriculture. The labor that made the land productive was stolen even more directly. Over 600 people worked without compensation for Jefferson during his lifetime. At even the lowest wage rates of the period, the value of that stolen labor exceeds any calculation. If Jefferson had been required to pay wages, he would never have been wealthy. He would have struggled to break even like farmers everywhere who had to balance income against expenses. His wealth existed only because he could force people to work for nothing and claim ownership of their children. Jefferson understood this. His 4% calculation proved he recognized enslaved people as the true source of his wealth. But he never took the logical next step of acknowledging that wealth built on stolen labor was illegitimate. Instead, he created philosophical justifications for maintaining slavery while claiming to oppose it. Enslaved people weren't ready for freedom. Immediate emancipation would be catastrophic. Gradual abolition might work if freed people were deported to Africa or the Caribbean. Always there was a reason why ending slavery had to be delayed, and that delay let Jefferson keep profiting until he died. The wealth Jefferson created didn't end with him. His white descendants inherited his social position, his connections, his reputation, and whatever material wealth survived the estate settlement. They attended good schools, they married well, they entered professions closed to most Americans. The advantage Jefferson created for them compounded across generations, exactly as he had calculated compound returns from enslaved children's births. Meanwhile, the descendants of Jefferson's enslaved workers started with nothing: no land, no education, no inheritance, no connections. And they face systematic discrimination at every turn. Jim Crow laws, segregation, redlining, discriminatory lending, employment discrimination, every policy designed to keep them economically subordinate. The wealth gap between white and black Americans today traces directly back to the system Jefferson participated in and profited from. Monticello today draws 500,000 visitors annually. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation has worked in recent years to present more honest history. New exhibits document enslaved people's lives. Reconstructed quarters on Mulberry Row tell specific stories. The foundation acknowledges Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. But even these improvements struggle against 2 centuries of mythology. Many visitors come expecting to celebrate Jefferson's genius. They want to see the architectural innovations, the clever gadgets, the signs of an extraordinary mind. When confronted with slavery's reality, some resist. They argue Jefferson was a man of his time, that he couldn't have acted differently, that we shouldn't judge historical figures by modern standards. They want to separate Jefferson, the philosopher, from Jefferson, the enslaver, to admire one while ignoring the other. This separation is impossible. Jefferson's philosophy and his his practice were inextricably linked. His ideas about natural rights grew from the same mind that calculated investment returns on human reproduction. His prose about liberty was written by hands that signed bills of sale for children. The contradictions weren't unfortunate accidents. They were the core of who he was. The Declaration of Independence remains one of history's most powerful statements. The words Jefferson wrote still inspire people fighting for freedom. But understanding where those words came from requires acknowledging what they cost. Every hour Jefferson spent writing was an hour someone else spent working his fields. Every meal he ate while composing eloquent prose was prepared by enslaved cooks. Every moment of leisure that let him think was stolen from people who had no leisure, no freedom, no ability to create anything they could call their own. Jefferson wrote that slavery was a moral evil. He called it a stain on America. He predicted God would punish the nation for this crime. He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway for 50 years. He chose comfort over principle, wealth over justice, personal fortune over human freedom. Some argue he was trapped by circumstances beyond his control, that he inherited slavery and couldn't escape it, that freeing enslaved people would have bankrupted him. These arguments fail. Washington freed his enslaved people despite similar circumstances. Other Virginia planters, though rare, found ways to emancipate at least some people they held. Jefferson had more resources, more influence, more options than almost any American of his time. He chose not to use them. He could have lived modestly and used savings to purchase freedom. He could have abandoned expensive Monticello renovations. He could have sold some vast landholdings. He could have used political influence to push for gradual emancipation in Virginia. He could have freed people in his will with land and resources for independence. He did none of these things. He chose instead to maintain his lifestyle, expand his estates, keep people in bondage until death forced a minimal, calculated reckoning. The 5 people he freed were the absolute minimum to maintain plausible deniability about Sally Hemings, freeing her children but not her, freeing members of her family but not the broader community, just enough to seem principled while preserving maximum wealth for white descendants. It was calculated to protect his reputation while keeping as many people enslaved as possible. Jefferson's legacy forces uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. Can we celebrate someone's ideas while condemning their actions? Can we honor principles someone articulated while rejecting practices they engaged in? Can we separate the Declaration from the man who wrote it? Should we? These aren't academic questions. They shape how we teach history, how we memorialize the past, how we think about national identity. Jefferson's face on Mount Rushmore makes a statement about who we honor. The Jefferson Memorial creates sacred space around his memory. Putting him on the nickel makes children handle his image before they understand his contradictions. Some argue we should remove Jefferson from places of honor. Others say keep the monuments but add context. Others insist we should focus on his ideas rather than his actions, treating him as a symbol of American ideals even when he failed to live them. What's clear is we can no longer teach Jefferson's story without confronting how he built his wealth. We can no longer present Monticello as simply architectural wonder without discussing who built it and at what cost. We can no longer quote the Declaration without acknowledging its author owned the people who made his writing possible. More than 2 centuries after Jefferson died, America still grapples with slavery's legacy, the wealth gap between black and white families, the persistence of racial discrimination, the mass incarceration of black Americans, the systematic disadvantages in education, employment, housing, healthcare. All of this connects to the system Jefferson participated in. All of this reflects choices made by men like Jefferson who built fortunes on human exploitation and created structures to preserve that exploitation across generations. Understanding Jefferson's path to riches isn't about canceling history. It's about seeing clearly how American prosperity was actually built. It's about recognizing the Founding Fathers created a nation deeply marked by contradiction between ideals and practice. It's about acknowledging that wealth accumulated through slavery didn't disappear when slavery ended. It transformed, evolved, found new forms, but the fundamental imbalance remained. Jefferson's story reveals that the path to enormous wealth in early America required abandoning the very principles Jefferson claimed most sacred. It required treating human beings as investment vehicles. It required calculating monetary value of children born into bondage. It required forcing people to work without compensation for their entire lives. It required violence, coercion, family destruction, and it required looking at all this suffering and deciding personal comfort mattered more than human dignity. Thomas Jefferson died believing his place in history was secure. He had written the Declaration. He had doubled the nation's size through Louisiana Purchase. He had founded the University of Virginia. The debts and auction were unfortunate necessities, not defining features of his legacy, but history reveals truths powerful men hope to bury. The enslaved people Jefferson tried to erase have returned to claim their place in his story. Sally Hemings and her children, the artisans who built Monticello, the field workers who grew the crops, the cooks and servants whose names fill his farm book alongside calculations of their economic value. They are part of Jefferson's story now. The marble monuments will stand. History books will continue debating Jefferson's legacy, but the truth is available to anyone willing to look at Jefferson's own records, to read what he wrote about slavery's economics, to follow the money from stolen labor to vast wealth. That truth is uncomfortable. It challenges American mythology, and it forces us to acknowledge that our most celebrated founder built his fortune through means we now recognize as evil. So when you see Jefferson's face on a nickel, remember the 609 people he enslaved. When you visit Monticello, think about the hands that built every brick. When you read the Declaration of Independence, remember its author calculated 4% returns on the birth of enslaved children. When you hear someone quote Jefferson's words about liberty and equality, remember he spent 50 years choosing wealth over the freedom of people whose labor made that wealth possible. Because Thomas Jefferson's path to riches was far darker than we realized. It was built on systematic exploitation of people he knew were entitled to the rights he proclaimed universal. It was maintained through calculations that reduced humans to dollar amounts and breeding stock, and it was preserved until his death, when the final reckoning sent over 100 people to the auction block to satisfy his debts. The contradictions weren't accidental. They were the foundation, and understanding the truth is the only way forward for a nation still living with the consequences of choices made by men who preached equality while profiting from bondage.